can't interview you without a webcam.
Oh shit.
Well, it's a video show.
Alright, I thought that we could just do it like we did the last time. I was making the soundtrack and...
Well, we can always do that. You want to do a soundtrack for an hour?
If just in the light of the acute issues that are facing me, I'd just love to get the news out across the Atlantic.
Alright.
And are you interested? I know that you've got private medicine everywhere you go in America. There is no...
Whoa. George, wait a minute. Let's start this. Can you get your volume up? Your volume is very low.
Is that better?
Yes, much better.
Okay.
Okay, hang on. This is Jim Fetzer on The Real Deal with a special interview with Professor George Lees. George, tell our audience a little about your background and your circumstances and why you feel what the situation you're in is a rather pressing matter that deserves widespread publicity.
Well, I'm a professor of pharmacology, which is quite ironic because I'm a political activist, as Jim knows, and I've made several interviews with him already, and I'm a strong follower of everything that Jim and Greg informed us about the monarchy frauds, and one of the things behind my recent persecution is that I've opened up on those monarchy frauds, and I've written now 3 times to Her Highness the Queen, pleading with her to take Britain back to honest politics and to be out of all of the scams that blight our world. She's one of the richest persons on our globe, and hers is the only reign where the whole of our citizenship have never been conscripted into war. That's a magnificent achievement.
Now, George, your situation is complicated, so you're going to have to go through it step by step, I think, to make it intelligible to the audience.
Yeah, so I'm a professor of pharmacology, that's drug science, and I've worked in Imperial College London, the University of Sunderland, and the last academic job I had was in the University of Otago in Dunedin, and it's got 3 campuses in Christchurch and Auckland as well, and we made it the best university in the country. In the previous audit it was 4th out of 7, so everybody sat up, everybody got their sleeves rolled up, and the academic profile was improved greatly, and because I'm so political, even as a scientist, mine's is the only University of Otago inaugural lecture that was not recorded, because they asked me to rehearse it, and when it became plain that I was hitting on Britain's science minister, yeah, who's Lord Sainsbury, who runs the massive supermarket chain, yeah, and he is the man, I believe, who sparked the obesity epidemic.
Were you allowed to give it but not record it?
Yes, the university recorded them and sent them out as iPods to anybody who requested it. I've got a PDF published, and I can send you it sometime. And it was the hitting on Lord Sainsbury was quite trivial. He was the science minister in the UK at that time, and he was the science minister when I left. And the obesity problems were becoming so intense in Britain that in Glasgow, at age 13 or 14, type 2 diabetes was becoming really prevalent. Yeah, and it's quite sickening that, you know, that because people have access to the foodstuffs, that they just engage like that. But it was a massive marketing campaigns. And so that was part of my inaugural lecture. A lot of it was on nerve gases, because I'm a toxicologist as well. And we'd had, you know, incidents like the Japanese subway incident, and I was able to comment on that, and I made several radio programs on that. And as you know, I'm very frank, and I put things as they are. And sometimes, because Britain still is largely in control of all of the Commonwealth countries and all of their business prospects, when Greg Hallett used to talk about that, and I said to him, you know, can you explain, Greg, who owns the media down there? I totally understand Murdoch and he's transiting across the world with the help of the CIA and all of the funders behind that. Greg said, George, after all I've told you, you still think that anything in New Zealand belongs to anyone in New Zealand? That's a joke. Yeah, and so I had empathy with those people down there, but the Brits still run the show. And when I came back, you know, they had a healthcare system down there that meant that their economy's small, and the GDP is tiny compared to Britain's, but they were very well organised, and the healthcare system was particularly prudent. They had a list of 12 common generic drugs, and they were almost exclusively used through all of the surgeries across New Zealand because it's cost effective that way. But because I'm a professor of pharmacology and I'm a fellow of the Pharmaceutical Society, when I come back home, the doctors, I believe, must have thought that when I left home I was a scientist and researcher in the pharmaceutical industry, and their associations with pharma in Scotland at the commissioning interface. Do you understand that when you've got a new clinical entity, you need to have it appraised and then launched onto the market? Yeah, and that is in the hands of civil servants, and the chief pharmacist in that sector for Scotland is a friend of mine. He's interviewed me at a couple of interviews since I came home. And what happens now is that all of the old established generic drugs get canned and they get replaced by new clinical entities, which is a fast buck for pharma. And the deal is that if you're prepared to engage in that as a doctor, and to be a doctor you have to be prepared, otherwise it costs you 40% of your salary. So they're meeting their prescribing targets for pharma by volume, and it means that Granny is given too many drugs, and the doctors are aware that that is not a good thing, and so they talk to me in the late stages of 2010. We came home in December 2009, so I was less than a year into Scotland, and they began to talk and whinge a little bit about the need for them to deliver drugs to the, particularly to the elderly, that they knew that they did not need. But because they're downgrading the safe and effective generics that were the only thing you could access in New Zealand, it's now become a marketing place for the new pharma products, and that is really, really sick. And the doctors that wrote to me in 2010 said that we'll have to wait until the election's over before we can make any positive intervention. And when the election was over, and they began to see that I was working on all sorts of fraud issues by that time, yeah, and you know the videos that we made on all of the money laundering things with Gordon Bowden and I on your program a couple of times.
Yes.
Yeah, so now we understand how the banks were busted in 2008. You call it the reset, we call it the banking crash, and we've got all of the culprits and all of the details and all of the directorial fraudsters that engaged in that. But more seriously now, and that's why I believe, so over the course between 2011 and last month, I had 3 sectioning threats from the doctors in that first 4 years. But since that, and since I reported the war crimes frauds, and I got the receipts for the war crimes frauds from the justice ministers in the Parliament building in Scotland, yeah, way before the referendum, and all of that could have freed Scotland in the referendum. You remember we talked about the referendum and we talked about electoral fraud, and you said to me, is there any way that Scotland could have lost if it was decent and honest? You remember that discussion?
Yeah, sure I do.
Yeah, and so
imagine any Scotsman not voting for Scottish independence.
Well, you see, there's a body in this country called the Better Off Together movement, which means that everything. There's ancient treaties going back to Longshanks that mean that Scotland can never own its own country. That's the Treaty of Berghem, and it was settled between Longshanks' kids and I think it was the Maid of Norway, and all of it means that Scotland can never ever be free constitutionally. And what we have in our British system now is a constitutional monarchy, and so the law courts in Scotland are run by the Crown Office, and that is one of the reasons why I've been persecuted since I came home, because they realise that I'm outspoken. They realise I'm on every. Can you look at your computer as we make the video? Could you get your Facebook page up, for example? I've posted several things on my Facebook page that would allow you to have a look and maybe turn your camera onto them, or is that impossible?
No, just talk about them, George.
Okay, I'll just get mine up here so that I can see what I'm referring to. So if you are you on my Facebook page now?
No, I'm on mine.
All right. Well, click on George Lee's and then scan down until you see some pictures of the Iraq inquiry issues. Oh, that's right on the top actually.
Yeah, it's just that it's very fine print and very difficult to
okay, read. If you click on those images below that bit of text. So let me introduce you to the two key characters at the top. On the left you have Malcolm Rifkind. In 2002, remember we went into Iraq in 2004. Malcolm Rifkind was the Foreign Secretary for Great Britain.
2003
yeah.
We went into Iraq.
Yeah, well that
2003,
is.
George.
So Rifkind is Tony Blair's Foreign Secretary, and the man who's, if you look at those two blue arrows, you'll see that it is Sir Leslie Rifkind and the Right Honourable Sir John Anthony Chilcot. Now they're interlocked on the board of a company called Abraxa there, and we revealed all of that way back with Gordon Bowden and some other investigative journalists. And basically that company that they ran, Abraxa, has been relocated several times since. It's a massive money laundering fraud. Can you see the Burness Solicitors label on that? Maybe if you click on the image it'll get bigger. It does.
Well, I'm making a copy of it. Yeah, it's bigger.
So click on it, and then you can scan down to the others. So Burness Solicitors and all of those people on there, WJB Directors Limited, they're laundering companies. When you see a little thin blue line like that one against WJB, it means that the products or the take from their company is being transferred out into the havens. It's called pump and dump. Can you see it? So right next door to 1996 for WJB at the bottom. And Rifkind is a major fraudster. He's on the board. Have you heard of G4S?
No, just tell us, George.
G4S were the company that failed to deliver the contract at the London Olympics. None of their staff showed up. They were allowed to keep the massive multi-million pound payoff. And I told you in the last interview that we made together who the director of that company is. It's the chair of Princess Diana's inquest. Can you remember who that was? Lord Condon, head of the Met Police. All of the Met Police leaders end up in profiteering exercises, and the G4S company is to asset strip the whole of British policing. So what they're doing is buying the police properties using the Lloyd's toxic debt pool. Have you heard of that? It's all of the companies that get crashed, all of the payoffs are from a pool of money that is non-existent. So it's totally insolvent for almost. Actually, Lord Sainsbury sold his supermarket into the Lloyd's toxic debt pool in 2002, same year. Yeah, and so that man, when I gave my inaugural lecture in New Zealand, was not actually still the boss at Sainsbury's, but I had no insight into the fraud at that time. Okay, so if you scan down, I'll take you back up to that woman, the name Dinah Ilias. She's on a now censored list of people that are allowed to do psychiatric appraisals of all of the victims and innocents in Scotland. So if you scan down a little bit further down your Facebook page, you'll see that we've got profiles of, yeah. So can you see the picture there that says Rothschild on the top and Rothschild Trust New Zealand?
Yes.
Click on it.
Well, I was trying to do a screen capture of it.
Oh, okay. Well, if you click on it though, it goes to the full screen size.
I'm clicking on it.
So, in the city of Edinburgh, which is it's twinned with Edinburgh, even the accreditation of our university in Dunedin had to be done by the academics in Edinburgh, even hundreds of years after the colonists went to the colonies. And what you've got there on that first picture on the left is the massive Ponzi schemes that are run by the Rothschilds in Lothian Road. Can you see that image? It says Lothian 50, 621, 911, 697, 724, 883. Yet there are thousands of Ponzi schemes in every one of the corrupted companies in that building. And sadly, the courtiers on the Bank of England, that's the boss of Cairn Energy, he's on the court of the Bank of England, and he runs the Cairn Energy fraud on behalf of Bill Gamble, who's a Scottish rugby player, but he's actually best friends with George W. Bush, and their parents and their grandparents started up a company in America called Bush Overby, and it's the launch of the virtual oil and gas frauds. That man, have you heard of the killing of Motley Flint in a cinema? Yeah. That's the launch of the Warner Brothers, but Motley Flint was intimately involved in that Bush-owned company, and it's a fraud in the oil and gas sector, one of the first frauds on the globe. Yeah, and George W. Bush came to Bill Gamble's wedding in Glasgow, and what you've got there is just a massive deck. When you see numbered companies like that all lined up from the same street address, it's a Ponzi scheme. You understand that? It's a pyramid selling scam, and all the savers and investors that now have no pensions at all are being robbed blind by the same companies that are represented on the court of the Bank of England. Do you see the magnitude? You realise what a central bank is there to do for its country in theory, but you and Greg totally understood how every central bank had been taken into Rothschild's ownership. Yeah, the last few to go were where was Castro from? Cuba. So Cuba and Gaddafi is Libya, and Saddam is
Iraq.
Yeah, those were the last few to go. Afghanistan was the last, and I remember Greg telling you about that in one of the last interviews that you made together, and how all of the opiate take there was a surrogate motive for moving into Afghanistan to take one of the last central banks off the hands of the locals. Yeah, so the whole world is run like in a fraudulent way like that, and you can see that some of those Ponzi shelves have nothing in them at all. They're the laundering vents, and in the business world now, the companies are allowed to declare their assets and their taxable holdings and their taxable gains, yet from their trading, at 4 times every year. So what they do with all those Ponzi shelves is that when they need to pay tax, they empty them, and To launder the money out of the country, you need to do it in less than £1 million at a time, otherwise it's subject to regulation. So it's a massive laundering scandal. And if we go back to the other sets of images, I'll show you some other typical examples. So the next one is, that's the woman who's on my mental health. So you're oh no, sorry, there's a, go now to the picture on the right hand side of the Facebook image. It's got a picture of Prince Charles on it.
Yeah.
So can you see that in high resolution? What you've got there is a typical boardroom, yeah, and a typical set of interlocks for Nathaniel Charles Jacob Rothschild. They've got huge holdings. That's the Institute for Jewish Policy Research, the Hermitage Development Trust, that's Russia, the Future of Russia Foundation. One of America's most famous citizens is on the board of that for a decade, and he's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. Does that tell you who that is?
Well, I presume it's Barack Obama.
No, it's Henry Kissinger.
Yeah.
Who Greg told you was the world's...
Another atrocity.
Well, Greg told you that statistically he was the world's biggest ever killer.
Yes.
And he's a Zionist, and he's planted... I think he's out of Germany originally, and
sure.
he trained the boss at the EU, who was President Barroso, and because I exposed that 2 years ago, Barroso has now been forced into resignation. They cannot stand up in the face of the accusations if you've got their director numbers. So Kissinger trained that man at Georgetown, and we talked about Georgetown in a warmongering context the last time, and the Institute for Jewish Policy Research is huge. It's got the Duchesses of Sutherland on it. It's got the people that helped the Rothschilds in their very earliest generations. They're called the Montefiore's. They're on the board of that, and it's full of massive political presences. So the Friends of Israel is a massive cross-party scam, because every one of the political party leaders are friends of Israel through all of the regimes that they engage in. That's the Labour Party, the Socialists, the Conservatives, and the far right, almost fascists. And what you've got on that board there is pictures of David Cameron looking nervous, because these are British government deals. That's the BSKYB group deal between 2003 and 2008. That's brokered by Murdoch's son, who's pictured at the bottom, just to the left of Murdoch. That's Prince Charles, and that is on the board. All of these interlocks, that's the Prince of Wales's charitable foundation. The world's owners are all on the same boards, and many of those boards are based in other people's countries. And you remember how when we made that video together that half of it had to be cut off because President Obama was just about to make a pivotal speech on what was going to happen in Ukraine? You remember that? There's a crisis in Ukraine. So what you've got there was the demonization of President Putin, when Prince Charles and the Prince of Wales is actually the owner of the Future of Russia Foundation in a geopolitical context. Putin is just a puppet in the G20 government, but he was, as you were told by Greg, a leading presence in their intel in New Zealand, along with Helen Clark, who became the boss at the UN Development Agency. If you look her in the eye now, you can see that she has a huge conscience, because she's a sexual deviant. She ran the country as a massive fraud, and basically she sold the whole of New Zealand down the Swanee, and she then became the UN boss. And Greg told me that within her first 18 months she'd already stolen, I can't remember whether it was $2 million or $8 million. She's now back in New Zealand, but all she's got is a Facebook page. She does not dare come back into public life. So you can see the massive interlocks between the world's owner. That's just one board. I've got dozens and dozens of them. And that's typical of what they do. So because I'm privy to all of what the world owners do to cast us into that global sovereign debt crisis, is every state in America insolvent?
I think North Dakota not, because it has its own state-run bank.
Oh, and I learned also that you have 13 central banks. You have 13 Federal Reserve banks?
I didn't think it was 13. I thought it was 8, but it might be 13.
They've got one in Minnesota, and some of the Americans that I know in my region have told me that that is only one. It may have been 10 to 13, but I'm pretty certain it was 13. And you know, that is just what is happening now. That the whole of the banking system is totally unregulated. What you've got are a group of 5,000 or so super elites that meet in Davos every year, and all of them are now handling and laundering all of democracy's funding out of the treasury and into their private accounts, which is why every country is in sovereign debt, and every one of the central banks is owned by private individuals that get massive salaries to be a fraud against the people of a foreign country. So we've got a man called Mark Carney who runs our central bank. He earns 800,000 a year declared, gets 250,000 housing allowance, and that's only what he does not have in the Rothschilds boardrooms. His predecessor was Mervyn King, and his predecessor was Eddie George. They are all over the Rothschilds boardrooms, even as the heads of our country's central bank. It is a scandal. Yeah? So there is no issuance of money to democracy now. They just print the money, and electronically. We talked about quantitative easing the last time. Yeah, and because I've got the director numbers, if we go back to the main Facebook page again.
I just look up, there are 24 Federal Reserve branches. In late 2008, there were 25.
Wow.
And in October 2008, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and Buffalo branch was closed.
And every one of them will have the capacity to issue coinage and notes?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Because some of the... the reason I sort of panicked and asked you whether I could make this video quickly is because I'm now being sectioned by psychiatric services in Scotland. Do I still sound reasonably lucid despite that stress?
Yeah, of course.
Good. Because what I'm being told is that everybody in the medical sector suspects that I have something wrong with me. And what I've got wrong with me is that I tell the truth, as you now know, and I've got all the documentary evidence for it in a series of dockets. So what has happened in the last... I wrote a letter to Her Royal Highness the Queen in the last day of July this year. She has still not responded, and that letter is exposing all of the instability of our economy in Britain, and all of these scams through the central bank, and all of the frauds surrounding the private individuals that run it. And what they run for the ordinary people are scams and virtual product frauds. So the Cairn boss, I think, was called Friedel, and the Cairn company was involved in a massive international scandal in that they released shares. I can't mind whether it was Vodafone. It was one of the big prominent companies, and there was a whole series of share release scams, and David Cameron was directly involved in that, and the president who had to resign was called President Singh in India, because I think it may have been Vedanta. That was the company that was crashed in the UK. All the investors lost their investments, and all the shareholders were crashed too, and they resold the shares to the Indians at 1/10 of the previous price, and Singh had to resign in shame. Cameron just carries on and thinks of England. And it's really quite tragic, but not nearly as tragic as what happened in Iraq. Yeah, the whole of that was totally premeditated, and you and I talked the last time that we talked about the Twin Towers and bringing them down, and that being the motive for the demonisation of those last remaining countries that still own their central bank. As soon as the countries are brutalised now, the stock market is created in the shells of the buildings, and everything has to be rebuilt from the rubble. So you can see, and when I came back from New Zealand and started to talk to the doctors, one of them, who was particularly guilty about what they do in the prescribing sector, well, he told me that they need to meet targets for prescribing. That means that the patients need to get a certain number of drugs. Yeah, it's totally lacking in objectivity and a case-by-case appraisal. So what they do to get £40,000 of their £100,000 salary, does that tally with what a doctor in America would earn? I think that every one of the doctors, my cousin came to visit us in New Zealand, and in the late noughties, she was absolutely ballistic that she is in the healthcare professions, but she's just an occupational therapist and they get a pittance for a pay. She was ballistic that every doctor in Britain gets over £100,000 for their salary, and I learned from the local doctors, and I was decent enough to shield their ID because they were concerned about what they had to do by coercion to earn that huge chunk of their salary. So I shielded them as Dr. X and Dr. Y, my friends, from the Brigadoon surgery. But within month or two of the election, when they said they would have to wait and see what the politics would be beyond the election, they then launched the first sectioning threat. And the man that launched that on me is a man called Dr. Ian Fingland, and he trained as a policeman before he trained as he trained as a policeman before he trained as a medic. And that is how all of the suppression of the honest people works. And now, from that relatively polite question, can we come and visit your home and talk about your mental health? Yeah? You're acknowledging that I'm still lucid and fluent, and I can explain the director numbers behind those images that you've just looked at for the war criminals. Yeah?
Well, I think it was a mistake if you invited them to come to visit you, George.
I never did. I never consented to that. I've written letters to them after they made those uninvited visits. Yeah? And those letters invite them to dinner. The sad bastards just want me silenced. They will stop at nothing to have me silenced. So in the last 2 or 3 weeks, the pressure has been racked up. Now I could tell you why the pressure has been racked up, because of this. The last time I talked about religion, it upset you a bit, and we had to curtail the interview. Dare I do that again?
Sure, just say what you want to say.
Oh, God bless you, Jim. So what I've discovered in the last few weeks is that the PISO family, who faked up the Christian Bible, were running the mint in Rome at least 120 years before they launched in the PISO family the Christ stories. Yeah, that was done in Naples under the Villa Papyri. The Villa Papyri sits under Vesuvius, and when the New Testament was released, it exploded onto their home. Yeah, and all of that is openly portrayed in Wikipedia. You can see the house. The original house was buried in lava, and they've rebuilt it. It's right underneath Vesuvius. So what I've learned since is that the Windsor bloodline, the FDR, the Roosevelt bloodline, and the Bush bloodlines are all directly related to the PISO family members that inhabited the Roman court and wrote the Christian Bible all those years ago. And that's the world's biggest secret, And since I revealed that in 2 videos, the law enforcement and the suppression of the innocent people have gone ballistic, because that is the ownership of the world that you and Greg used to talk about only in a monarchy context. Can you see what I'm telling you there? That is the mint in Rome. That's the launch of the corrupted banking system. Yeah, and it is the Christian church that takes over the whole of the world in the massive crusades, and all of a sudden you have lost your 500 nations. That's the indigenous pagans that were the American Indians, and all of that is a human tragedy. The gods can never replace those gene pools again. They're gone forever. So that is the series of disclosures that I started to make, and it's amazing how the family... Have you heard of a newsman in Britain for the BBC? He's legendary at sad events like the burial of Princess Diana. His name is David Dimbleby. Yeah, and his brother is Jonathan Dimbleby. Every year they are the people that shed the crocodile tears at the War Memorial, with the Queen, with all her illegitimacy, being the brother of Bill Clinton, as you and Greg described. Yeah, all of that takes place in front of the War Memorial. And when we made that last curtailed video, it was on Remembrance Sunday, and I told you about Mr. Bean and the Anzac war dead, and Mr. Bean being the war correspondent for Gallipoli. That's the Joker that opened the London Olympics as a laugh at the Anzac war dead. It is really, really serious, and they will stop at nothing to silence me. So this week I've had, it was three sectioning threats a fortnight ago. This week, in the last fortnight, it has become 8, and the 8th one is a forced medication threat that I will be sedated, I will be physically manipulated so that they can inject a slow delivery intramuscular injection of antipsychotic drugs that are absolutely toxic, and in the clinic they give you little more than the placebo effect that you would get from taking a spoonful of lactose. Yeah, it's an absolute scandal, and that is how my boys were educated at a legendary boys' school in New Zealand. It's legendary for producing all-black rugby captains, but before it became a boys' school, it was an asylum. And there are loads and loads of massive psychiatric institutions like that around the globe that have now become either schools. In the case of the fraudulent Royal Bank of Scotland, they run their headquarters in Scotland out of the asylum at Gogarburn. It's been rebuilt and it now looks much posher than it did, but it's just a massive scandal that if you speak the truth, you're going to be interned in either a straitjacket or, more seriously, in a psychiatric institution. They've got that lined up for me on the 2nd of October, less than 5 days away now. Yeah, I'm not allowed to defend myself. I'm not allowed to deny that I have any problems. Yeah, I'm not allowed. And what they're doing it for is because it coincides absolutely with my wife's desertion of my home. Yeah, and what they're doing now is negotiating the future of my home and all of our joint assets. So if I get the antipsychotic drugs that make me incapable of thinking clearly and talking clearly in defence of my own home that I totally owned before I met my wife, can you see how clever the timing of that is? Yeah, and the divorce solicitor that's in charge of that is formerly the council solicitor, and all of the sad bastards run care homes after they've dropped out of the council that used to be council assets, but now they're private for-profit companies. Yeah, and if you give Granny too many drugs, and the doctor that lives in my housing estate is on the board of the care home, they get £600 a month for every elderly patient that is interned there, and then Yeah, they get the house that Mrs. Thatcher sold them back, because it's the only way that Granny can pay for her future. And all the kids are somewhere else on different continents, and it is really, really sad. And the people that run the law system for the council now run the care homes and the divorce solicitor sector that I'm in. And I'm the only person in this divorce, because we've had our our savings frozen by the Jedburgh Sheriff Court. They have not released the signatory of the warrant yet, and that happened to me nearly 5 weeks ago now. So I've had my energy shut down, so I cannot continue to keep paying to keep making these videos, and I can only top up the meter that they have installed. The installation of the meter involved a 5-hour visit of 5 people, so that I could not make the video on the PISO Frugi mint fraud. My home is intimately surveilled, yeah, under a scheme called RIPAS, which can only be condoned by the Foreign Secretary in London. That news is out before I leave New Zealand, that this guy is a heretic. He tells the truth about what Lord Sainsbury does, and he tells the truth about the frauds and all of those nerve gases and things that were used in the world wars and are now a toxicological menace. Yeah, and all of it, the news is out that I'm an honest man before I come home from New Zealand, and when I get home, the whole of my life here has been in persecution. Yeah, I'm a fellow of the Pharmaceutical Society. I was a prof at the best university in New Zealand, and I brought back a huge tranche of equipment. None of them would give me a job, and all of them I have now shamed as vice chancellors in those interviews, because they are stealing from their own students now. £60,000 a year for everything that the boss at Imperial College London got for nothing. And the boss at Imperial College London, do you know who she is, Jim?
Tell me, George.
Yeah, she's the head of Intel in Britain. MI5, Miss Elizabeth Manningham Buller. And all of our predecessors have been pharma magnates and my old bosses, and it is just tragic. The whole of the university sector is being asset stripped. The whole of the policing sector is being asset stripped, and all of the NATO's armies that go to fight for this great cause that is the G20, yeah, they're actually fighting for the world's mafias, and you knew that.
George, our audio connection has just taken a hit. Can you speak up?
I'm just describing the G20 as, the G20 are now effectively the world's mafias. Yeah, yeah. And you're aware of that. You're aware of the sovereign debt crisis and the fact that none of the central banks now at Christmas time, I was in Sainsbury's supermarket, and all of the people are decent. All of the people talk to me. I am not a menace to anybody in this town. That's why they want me silenced with the pharmaceuticals, so they can make it look relatively gentle. Yeah, and when I walked into the supermarket, I said to the people with the red buckets, is it another comedy, or is it a medical charity? And they said, oh no, we're school teachers. We cannot afford desks for our school. It's a primary school, and we have no computers left at work. That's all of the public sector commitment to fund that has been removed. And the man who runs the Las Vegas military tattoo, who gives the speech on the Easter weekend, on the War Memorial weekend, who's the head of the British Legion with the medals all over his chest, has asset stripped. His name is Alistair Hutton. He's a major fraudster. He runs the Las Vegas military tattoo for profit, and that's a joke about all Scotsmen being sent to their deaths all over the world, all through human history. Yeah, and what he does is also, everything that he runs in the council is run in a debt pool. It's run by an organisation called COSLA, which are the chief executives of the councils, and it meets in Aberdeen, and they just run a massive debt pool. But Councillor Hutton's private interests are in literature and Robbie Burns and the Walter Scott Foundation, and they're filthy fucking rich at those places with millions at the bank. The Robbie Burns thing is called SRU, so it can be obfuscated by the insolvent Scottish Rugby Union. Yeah, but they've got huge millions and millions at the bank. His council organisations are busted, and they are also in those massive Lloyd's banking group and the HBOS toxic debt pools, and that is still the residue of the banking crash in 2008. It was not a crash, it's just a pump and dump. They take the money all over the world, into the havens, into the Channel Islands, across into Bermuda, into Cuba, and all of those legendary places that the mafias were using in the Godfather movie. Yeah, and so that's the reason why they want me silenced. But the world's biggest secret is that the Windsors, for all of that time, and it's amazing how they transition through the Frankish nations and across the fascist Dutch coast. Yet when Christianity comes west, some of the jokes are quite vicious. The biggest church in the world before the Vatican was built is a joke about Hollywood. Can you guess where that is? The sexiest man in Hollywood. Who was that for 2 decades?
I hesitate to guess.
Okay, well, it's George Clooney. The Clooney Abbey is the biggest church in the world, and it's the PISO family are the launch of all of the story about the fraudulent Jesus Christ. So when they get their cathedral across into Glasgow, can you guess what the name of the place was that led to all of the sectarian violence in Ireland?
Tell me, George.
Paisley. It's Paisley Abbey. Every time you see the word pie, it's a joke about the PISO family. The Pishon is the name for the Nile, and all of the translations into different languages of that PISO word. So you remember the Life of Pi film and the pie in National Velvet with Elizabeth Taylor?
Yeah.
Pistorius, all the shenanigans about the Blade Runner, it's just a cover. Every time that word comes into popular culture, it has to be covered up by Fox News or the Warner Brothers or the BBC. And I was going to tell you about Dimbleby. So Dimbleby is the sad bastard who mourns at Princess Diana's funeral and mourns at the war dead. He's just a cover for one of the close relatives to FDR's family. Yeah, and Eleanor and all of those links to Matilda, they're in that elite bloodline that takes you into the FDR family, and that is the waltzing Matilda song that the Pogues sing about the brutalisation of all of the Anzac troops in Gallipoli. Have you heard of the Pogues? If you look at their albums and you watch the images of the troops being massacred, yeah, and all of that sectarian violence, so the emphasis on the Paisley word and the cathedral in Glasgow being called Paisley Abbey, it's the launch of Ian Paisley, the sectarian violence man who's the Protestant in Ireland. And when Gordon Bowden and I revealed all of the secrets about the Catholic leadership team and all of the Chinook crashes and all of the Teamsters that brought that down so that the Irish Troubles could be extended, yeah, beyond, that's the Mulligan tyre crash. Have you done fatal accident inquiries into that and the motives behind it and the perpetrators?
Tell us more, George.
Oh, have you never heard of that? Never dissected it yourselves?
I think I haven't.
Oh, okay, so you remember that the Beatles sang, Paul McCartney sang Mulligan Tyre a full decade before the crash, okay? Like they do with all the songs about the Yellow Submarine and Hitler's jokes that Greg told you. But what happened there was that everybody had 29 experts in policing, military violence, and all of the special ops personnel in the same Chinook helicopter with 2 pilots, and they've had 13 inquests. Peter Eyre was the investigator that told me that vehicle was brought down by the US Navy SEALs from RAF Machrihinish opposite the Isle of Arran, and all of that. When Peter and I republished that, they had the biggest winter storms on the Isle of Arran. It meant that the whole of the tourist economy was shut down almost until May. They had massive snowdrifts, and all of the motives for that were just to keep the sectarian violence going. And do you know some of the people that, when I showed you that boardroom with Prince Charles, the Murdochs and the BSKYB politicians on it, yeah, you've got links to Rebecca Brooks, who's the Sun editor for Rupert Murdoch in London. She's a massive criminal. She interlocks with Prince Charles's financial advisors in Geneva, and she's got huge strings of companies. Yeah, she was the former editor of their publishing empire in Britain, and I forget where I started on that one. It took us.
Well, you were talking about the crash that brought down.
Oh yeah. So the crash, the links to Ireland and the troubles in Ireland is that General Sir Mike Jackson is a massive fraudster. He now runs private security companies, but not quite as vicious as the ones that were run by the former MI6 man who's Richard Dearlove. Yeah, he runs a company called Ergo, and it's got Israeli tank commanders and several Israeli prime ministers on it. Yeah, and that's the head of MI6, who's able to do away with anyone that he understands intimately because he's the head of British Intel, and that becomes the head of British money laundering now. And Greg explained that along with the insurance industry, they're the main laundering vents now. So all of those Intel presences in peacetime spend their time laundering money around the globe out of these illicit boardrooms. Yeah, so Mike Jackson is the launch of the cover-up of Michael Jackson and the demonisation of Michael Jackson the pop star. You remember that? How he was hanging babies out of windows, and he was alleged to have been overdosed by his anaesthetist. Yeah, that is the cover for General Sir Mike Jackson that brutalised the Balkans, was involved in Bloody Sunday and the murder of 2 innocent children in Bloody Sunday, and he then goes into, in the later phases of his life, the profiteering in Iraq as well. Yeah, one of the generals in NATO's armies. Some of the others are on the board of the NM Rothschild Bank. That is General Sir Charles Guthrie, on the board of the NM Rothschild Bank, made a lord of our country by Tony Blair in 2002. Yeah, it's massive, and it keeps rolling on and on and on. But now when you tell when you tell Cameron that you're onto what he does, and you tell him that he must not proceed with the bombing of Syria or wherever they're planning to brutalise next, because they realise that I'm such a potent instrument, and all of it will be published in thousands of YouTube videos within the next few weeks, then they opt out of the policies now. And I would like to thank Cameron again on air for taking that much more conciliatory stance. Tony Blair was a big genocidal leader, but Cameron has made much more conciliatory gestures since he took over. But the whole world is still really, really badly corrupted, and it does not get more corrupted than stealing from the central bank that should be funding your democracy. And I think what you're telling me is that America's now got 25 of those vents. And it's a bit like what Greg told us in those early days, was that I remember, I think it was either you or Red Ice Radio was talking to. He said that in the early days of the Wild West, when there were just small towns built in wood entirely, that there were 6,000 towns that were savvy enough to issue their own currency or their own equivalent of the dollar. Yeah, and that allows them to trade locally, and everything's quite prosperous. But when the banks get sequestered, then it's totally lawless. Yeah, and all the premeditated banking crashes and things that they do now that they're loaning all of that money to the British students, the bank rate at the moment and the rate of interest that is levied on their £60,000 debt pool is 0.05%. If George Osborne, the bastard, because he's been in it for 2 regimes now, he's the Chancellor out here, if he raises that bank rate to something like 5%, which all of us have to make do with, for our investments and things, you don't get as much as 5% now. All of the accounts that I've held open with my wife, all of them now, that are just ordinary savings accounts with no commitments for the banks, they earn 0.05% interest for the decent and honest savers, and all of the scamsters make their massive profits out of those virtual pump and dump scams where they release shares in fraudulent products. Yeah, the oil and gas thing, Karen have no products at all. That's the picture I showed you with Hannah Rothschild on the front, and in sad memory of those who lost their lives for families of loved ones in war. All those Ponzi shells are in products that are non-existent. It's virtual oil and gas. Yeah, right across the whole world, and that is how our world leaders behave, and they cast our children into that massive toxic debt pool. So that's why they want me silenced. And I've not talked a lot about the healthcare frauds. I could talk more about that if you want, or I could read you some of the pathetic correspondence.
Today we only have a few more minutes.
Yeah,
can you take any measures to protect yourself legally?
I'm just talking to as many people as I can, and by getting videos out like this as profusely as I can with as many images as I can. Let me cite you.
George, we only have 2 minutes. You can close out. Round this out however you like.
Okay. So there's. If you can refer your audience to 8th sectioning threat and compulsory medication order, Fingland, Switzer, Mr. Guy Cooper, 7 days notice, war crimes and frauds against the people and the patients. It's got my receipt from the Scottish Justice Secretary for the Trident nuclear weapons scandal, a massive financial fraud run out of the City of London. We talked about Bernie Ecclestone and this company being run from Ecclestone Square in London in our War Crimes Jokes video on Remembrance Sunday last year. Okay, so that's a receipt from the highest law enforcer in Scotland. His name is Michael Matheson. Yeah, for my revelations that the Trident nuclear weapon extinction threat is run out of London for profit with massive laundering shelves to take the profits into other tax havens. Okay, and it's got pictures of Justice Secretary Michael Matheson, the Trident documents, yeah, John Lamont MSP, who's my local MP and who's privy to the 50 Lothian Road Rifkind crimes involving Chilcot and Chilcot's inquests. Have you heard of University of Warwick rules?
I'm not sure I have.
Yeah, so that's where they prepare the script for all of the Muppets that participate in the profiteering, and that if you do not adhere to the script, you get a bullet in the head. And everybody now understands that. It's a joke about Tom of Warwick being the innocent little boy who saw King Arthur narrowly fail to make a decent kingdom of our country. Yeah, so it's Warwick University rules. It is the fraudulent fudging of every inquest into the Chinook crash, into the Arms for Iraq inquiry, and the sheriff on my divorce case interlocks with the man who wants Westminster to be independent of Scotland, and with the fatal accident inquiry chair, the law firm that is Levy and McRae. The name of the boss of Levy and McRae is Peter Watson. So he interlocks with my current sheriff on my divorce case that has frozen my assets, frozen my energy, and he is also on a massive set of law companies, and he's the one who I told you about that runs the toxic debt pool of £26 million from those law companies. All of them launder, all of them have got Ponzi shells all over it. So that's John Lamont MSP. The next image is Paul Wheelhouse, who's the MP for Hawick, and you've got a whole series of my calls, pictures of the Trident nuclear weapons, blocked Mr. Guy, and then the story about their intention to section me. There's all the documents showing me how little time I have to prepare, how this will happen, whether or not I am in attendance at the hearing, and what they're threatening me with is the hypodermic and subcutaneous long-lived injections of drugs that I have no need for.
This is Jim Fetzer thanking my special guest, Professor George Lees, for a story of incredible complexity, immense depravity, and total corruption. I very much appreciate everything you've had to say, George, and look forward to featuring you again. This is. Can
I just pop in just half a dozen more names, because they are really important? Yeah, these are former private secretaries to Mrs. Thatcher. Right Honourable Sir Archibald Gavin Hamilton interlocks through McCalls of Monaco with the Rainers of Ukraine. Yeah, they're involved in the Rothschild Ponzi scams in Lothian Road, Edinburgh, and in Auckland, where I used to work as an academic. The company Melrose and Porteous has a director on it who's linked into the Douglas Home Prime Ministerial family, directors at Birmingham City Football Club, and Michael Moore, my disgraced former MP, who was on the Scottish Cabinet as Secretary of State for Scotland. He's privy to all of the secrets of Dunblane, the massacre, the Chinook crashes, all of the arms to Iraq inquests, which have never been convened. And that man, Michael Moore MP, when he left office, was running an assassination bureau called Crawl from Glasgow, and 3,000 Ponzi shells in the Parliamentary Democracy, the Parliamentary Foundation for Democracy Limited, in league with Melrose and Porteous, who for a time, before they realised the conflicts, took me on as my divorce solicitors. Massive links to George Soros and JP Morgan, all of those sad bastards, and Prime Ministers.
Professor George Lees, I can't thank you enough. This is Jim Fetzer, your host on The Real Deal. Looking forward to having you back again. Thank you so very much.
And if I'm slurring, Jim, I hope that you understand that and you can reveal why I'm incapable next time of being coherent and thinking deeply, because that is what the antipsychotic drugs will do to me. I'm an expert in that sector. Thanks ever so much for the chance.
My great pleasure, George, and good luck with all of this.
Okay, cheers, Jim. Thanks ever so much.
You got it, my friend.
Bye.
Bye now.